Let's say you try something, but you only do it half-heartedly. And then you fail, and you think, well, I didn't really fail because I held a bunch back in reserve, and so I didn't get what I wanted, but maybe had I been all in, I would have. And so you don't have to upbraid yourself too much for the failure. Now, it's a catastrophic way to live. If you don't let yourself know what you need and want, what's the probability that you're going to do a random walk in the right direction? I mean, an act of existential courage to ask yourself what you need and want. If I could have what I needed and wanted in a manner that would be best for me, and you can imagine that takes a fair bit of orientation to get that question right, then what would my life look like? And that's a frightening question. People generally are loath to ask themselves that question because there's a couple of reasons. One is maybe you feel you don't deserve it. Well, another is you don't know that that's what you should do because we're so badly taught that this idea is generally not presented to people, which is just absolutely appalling beyond belief as far as I can tell. But then there's more impediments too, because one of the things people do to buttress themselves against failure is to never let themselves really gain clarity about what they need and want. Let's say you try something, but you only do it half-heartedly. And then you fail, and you think, well, I didn't really fail because, I held a bunch back in reserve, and so I didn't get what I wanted, but maybe had I been all in, I would have. And so you don't have to upbraid yourself too much for the failure. Now, it's a catastrophic way to live, to sit on the fence and to not commit, because instead of risking the possibility of failure, you engage in what's essentially the absolute certainty of failure. Because if you want something worthwhile and difficult, which you probably do if you want to have an adventure and go somewhere, then what's the chance you're going to get it if you're halfway in? It's like, if you can, then you didn't aim high enough, obviously, and that's not going to be exciting or engaging. And so if you're actually pursuing something that would motivate you maximally, you can't be halfway in. But that sort of protects you against failure, because you can tell yourself, well, if I tried, I could have done it. It's like, you tell yourself that 200 times and your life's over. And so I would seriously not recommend that. And then another problem is that if you let yourself know what you need and want, then you can betray yourself, right? So do you trust yourself? And the answer is, well, not really. And the reason is, well, I trusted myself before and I misbehaved terribly, so why would I do that again? And fair enough, that's a solid question. But on the other hand, if you don't let yourself know what you need and want, what's the probability that you're going to do a random walk in the right direction? Especially given that there's lots of ways to randomly walk, and there are very few pathways to what you really need and want. And so it's an act of faith, and I don't mean the belief in preposterous things. I mean an act of existential courage to ask yourself what you need and want. Imagine you wanted to live without bitterness, you want to live without cynicism, and maybe even more, you wanted to live in something approximating a spirit of play. What would you need and want to make that happen? Well, it's very terrifying to allow yourself to envision that. First of all, because you've made your conditions for failure very clear. Second, because you've set yourself up to betray yourself in a fundamental way. And third, often the apprehension of the distance between you and that goal can also be demoralizing and overwhelming. Now, I think the way you deal with that is you can make a lot of progress incrementally. Once you specify a goal, you don't have to leap from where you are to the goal in one fell swoop. If you could, you probably didn't set a difficult enough goal. It's okay to make incremental movement forward. That's why there's another rule here, which is compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. If you get the comparison right, you can say, well, here's where I'm headed and it's worth going to. You have to ask yourself that. Is there a place I could head to that would be worth getting to? And that's a question. And you have to be acting in your own best interest. And then that exposes you to all these potential calamities that we just described. And that's a big risk, but it's not nearly as big a risk as never getting what you want and need. And that is definitely the alternative. And that's a pathway to bitterness and cynicism and a wasted life. And bitterness and cynicism, that's just where that starts. It gets way worse as it compounds. And so it's very useful to treat yourself like you're someone you're responsible for helping. And it is very useful to compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. There's no way of interacting with someone, including yourself, that's more productive than to give targeted reward where credit is due, to give credit where credit is due. And you might say, well, how can I treat myself well, given that I'm nothing but the embodiment of serpentine, what would you call it, errors and sins? And the answer is, well, if you're a little better than you were previously, that's something. Really. And maybe that's what you want to see in your kids, right? I mean, you don't want to push them too far. You don't want to punish them if they haven't made huge leaps forward developmentally. What you want to see is incremental progress that requires some effort. And that's actually what your kids really love too. You know, if they're playing hard, they're on the edge, they're pushing themselves to develop their skills, maybe they're playing a sport, they're pushing themselves to move incrementally at the optimum rate. That's another thing that play indicates, by the way. That's so cool to know too. Play signals that you're pushing yourself forward at the optimal rate. Because you can't stay static and you can't absorb too much change at once. How do you know when it's right? Well, it's engaging, it's meaningful, but at the highest level, it's something like play. You know, when you're playing a sport, you want to play against someone who's approximately the same level of skill as you, or maybe a little beyond, right? If you're playing a game with someone who's approximately your equal, and you're pushing each other exactly enough to facilitate optimal movement forward. And that's actually a very good conceptual scheme for apprehending the nature of a marriage.